The US and Iran might reach an agreement today, right? If so, what would it be? And if not, what's going to happen next? What's the real reason behind the CCP closing its borders? Today, I've gathered evidence from 3 sources to explain it clearly. Also, Madani has emerged in Michigan. Syed won the Democratic primary for the Senate, which is unprecedented. How do you manage to win? A viewer shared with us the possible secret behind this. And another thing, Fauci refused to answer 111 times in Congress. Will there be consequences? Starting today, Fauci could be facing the threat of prison time. Welcome to Good Morning America, hosted by Fang Wei. Thanks for listening and watching. Hello to our YouTube viewers and our listeners on Sound of Hope Silicon Valley, FM 96.1. Okay, President Trump said Wednesday that the current ceasefire talks were requested by Iran. I hope for a diplomatic solution, and I'd prefer a deal because I don't want to kill anyone. Yeah, those are truly his heartfelt sentiments. President Trump expected a deal by Wednesday or Thursday. Wednesday has passed, so will there be a deal on Thursday? Well, that remains a big question mark for now. There's another perspective explaining why this is happening. Reuters reported Tuesday, citing sources familiar with U.S. military data, that in 5 months of conflict with Iran, the Army has nearly exhausted its entire stockpile of tactical and precision strike missiles. Specifically, U.S. Patriot missile stocks are down to 50%. THAAD is down to 20%. And Tomahawk cruise missile inventories have dropped to 50% of their original levels. But President Trump said we have far more ammunition than anyone else in the world, well beyond our needs. Our defense companies are producing more ammo than ever, while expanding our factories and equipment at record levels. As we build up our stockpiles, we'll start distributing more ammunition to our allies in Europe and other regions. So what is the situation on the Iranian side? Regarding Iran, the latest news from Axios is that the U.S., Iran, and Oman are close to a temporary deal for the Strait of Hormuz. It includes 60 days of interim maritime security, which could be extended. So what does that mean? Ships entering the Gulf will use the northern route by Iran, while those exiting will use the southern route through Omani waters. No transit fees for 60 days, and all mines in the Central Channel will be cleared within 30 days. According to 2 regional sources, Iran's foreign minister has agreed in principle, and the Supreme Leader and National Security Council completed the approval process on August 4th. However, both sides still have disagreements and differing views on the fee mechanism and the issue of sovereign control. I can't help but add my own comment here. I feel many U.S.-Iran deals are vague, basically just ending in a blurry compromise. Actually, there are many points of contention behind this. You say Iran basically controls half of the strait and Oman controls the other half. But this means that since Iran controls the ships entering the strait, it's essentially in total control, right? This is what's called a bottleneck, a vital passage. So Iran, well, the next step in controlling the strait would definitely be to charge fees, right? But the U.S. doesn't agree to that. Not agreeing to fees while still wanting to sign this agreement, that itself seems very strange to me. So I think that last MOU was just full of vague details. It seemed like it was just to, entice Iran to sign. Everything was stated vaguely and generously, but in their hearts, they didn't agree. So on this point, I think, well, there are some issues. Okay, so next, there are 2 changes. One major change, a change that is also rumored, according to Iran's official media. This outlet called Fars said that Iran rejected a proposal from Oman regarding the strait, wanting to manage it themselves. What that's really about, we don't know. Second, and very crucially, the commander-in-chief of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Vahidi, announced on Wednesday that as long as the U.S. and Israel have nuclear weapons, we will continue to develop them. What does that mean? It means if you can have them but I can't, that's unfair. If you have them, then I must have them too. So this means they will absolutely refuse to, stop developing nuclear weapons. At the same time, other reports say Iran's president, Pezeshkian, said he has no way to reach the supreme leader. He's strictly controlled by internal hardliners. Even if this or that is signed, it won't count in the end. All right, so that's the situation. So what's really going on between the 2 sides, honestly? On the Iranian side, they've always said there are 2 factions. I think in many ways the US side has also accepted that there are two factions, which is why they can't reach a deal. To be honest, I'm quite skeptical about this. You know, if there really were two internal factions, that would be the Iranian regime's greatest weakness, right? Because there's an English saying, a house divided against itself can't stand. Right? Excuse me? So if they really had two factions, wouldn't they be fighting each other? Clearly, they aren't fighting now, right? Instead, they seem to be protecting each other and passing the buck. The negotiators don't have to take any responsibility. After talking, they just say, hey, they won't do it, so what can I do? Well, regardless of how Iran chooses to present itself, we don't know what's really happening behind the scenes. But Vahidi did talk tough, saying, you have nuclear weapons, so why can't we? Okay, so someone who understood that statement perfectly has stepped up. That's the Israeli Prime Minister, Netanyahu. He said, today we heard the Revolutionary Guard commander, Vahidi, clearly announce that Iran intends to continue developing nuclear weapons. His word was continue. Well then, as the Prime Minister of Israel, I am also determined to continue. I will continue to prevent Iran from possessing nuclear weapons. Then he continued, regardless of whether there is a diplomatic agreement, meaning between the US and Iran, Israel will continue to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. What does that mean? Let me translate for Netanyahu. What he means is, no matter how much the US negotiates, it's just between you and Iran. It doesn't apply to us. Of course, while Netanyahu was talking tough, he didn't forget to consider President Trump's feelings. He said he praised President Trump as Israel's greatest friend in the White House and appreciated the joint efforts of the US and Israel to counter Iran's nuclear ambitions. So I'll say it again, my advice to President Trump has always been three things, you know. The first is the best option, which is to overthrow the regime and pull out the roots. The middle option is for Israel to play the bad cop and Trump to play the good cop. Now, it's only natural for Israel to be the bad cop, they really are, and Trump can truly be the good cop. Israel fights with all its might without draining U.S. military strength or using up U.S. ammunition. Then, when Iran can't take it anymore, Trump steps in as the nice guy. Isn't that better? Iran plays the good cop, bad cop act well, even if it's not genuine. But the good cop, bad cop act between the U.S. and Israel, that's the real deal. Now, the worst option is to shoulder everything yourself, which is President Trump's current strategy, doing it all alone while restraining Israel, telling them not to act out, that he'll handle it. So what will the outcome be? We certainly hope that through this whole process, President Trump can gradually realize how to truly deal with this Iran issue. All right, so moving on to our next topic, which is a major one, today's main subject, what the CCP calls closing off the country. So what's the real reason behind it? First, let's talk about the first point, a long article published by the Financial Times yesterday, which basically says that the CCP has launched a global tax recovery campaign to track down hundreds of billions of dollars in unpaid taxes from the past few decades, while significantly expanding controls on capital outflows. Now, this policy of the CCP, it differs from the typical anti-tax evasion policies of most countries in two ways, which makes it particularly worth our analysis today. First, it specifically targets the ultra-wealthy, and there's evidence for this. The Financial Times has its sources. Second, it's retroactive, going back into the past. How many years back? Going back over 25 years. So let's first talk about the background of this. The CCP's budget revenue mainly relies on tax income. Actually, since the pandemic, the CCP's tax revenue hasn't gone up, it's been falling. In 2024 alone, it dropped by 1.7%, down to 22 trillion yuan, which is about $3 trillion and change. And land transfer fees, once a core revenue source for the government, have seen total income drop from a peak of 8.7 trillion in 2021, 5 years ago, to 4.2 trillion last year after the real estate crash. So it's been cut by more than half. Even so, the central government is still considered wealthy, huh? But local governments rely almost entirely on land revenue. So what happens after the land market crashes? So the phenomenon appearing everywhere is that all provinces, cities, and autonomous regions across the country are in deficit. They're all losing money every year. At the same time, local civil servants and public institutions are seeing pay cuts, including wage arrears, which are happening everywhere. Another thing is selling off assets. So local governments are selling shares in state-owned enterprises, local SOEs, and franchise rights, including selling parking spaces, even selling cafeterias, selling advertising space, and so on. Even trying all sorts of ways to liquidate various assets to get cash. To put it simply, in one sentence, the government has run out of money. The government has no money, so what do? The Financial Times reports that according to foreign officials, as well as Chinese bankers and family office managers, as you know, many of China's wealthy move their money abroad. They'll hire what are called family offices to specifically help them allocate assets, even including helping them overseas, to settle down and things like that. They're called family offices. They revealed that the Bank of China and other Chinese communist financial institutions have been instructed to conduct audits on the overseas investments of China's ultra-wealthy. The focus is on several areas: real estate, stocks, precious metals, and cryptocurrencies, and other such assets, specifically the gains obtained from the purchase of these assets. Not just that, but also offshore trusts. What is an offshore trust? I'll explain that in a bit. This has been confirmed by multiple sources. The Financial Times confirmed through various sources that these actions are also retroactive in nature. Some audit periods go back over 25 years, even as far back as the year 2000. For example, a head of a family office in Shenzhen said that his client was required to pay taxes on offshore asset gains between 2017 and 2022. As for why it's 2017 to 2022, there's no official explanation for that. Well, let me explain. Basically, the officials just crunch the numbers, right? They figure by squeezing 5 years worth, this immediate cash should be enough for now, and they'll save the other 20 years to squeeze later. Isn't that how it is? That's my take on it. Whether you agree or not, feel free to leave a comment, especially if you know the inside story. Okay, so the specific approach here is this. A 20% tax is levied on dividends and interest earned from offshore insurance policies. Furthermore, regarding the rights to assets transferred into offshore trusts, a comprehensive tax regulation has also been issued. So the income generated by offshore trusts will be taxed at 20% across multiple stages, basically a flat 20%. So what exactly are offshore trust assets? Offshore trust assets are when wealthy Chinese people transfer their assets to a third party, the trustee. The assets are no longer mine, you hold them for me. But how is this money used? We need to have an agreement at the time of transfer, for example, giving it to children or making donations to certain causes and so on. This way, they can avoid paying taxes while also fulfilling their wishes on how they want the money spent. This is what's called offshore trust assets. Now, all of these used to be tax exempt, but now they're being pursued. There's no escape. So many trust holders are expected to face a one-time tax liability. Some people, because they don't have the money, can't pay up. Because when you calculate it back 10 or 20 years, it's terrifying how much money that is. They simply don't have the cash. They even have to sell assets to pay these taxes. The Financial Times mentioned a banker from South China who said that the Bank of China is now coordinating with tax authorities to freeze the bank accounts of these ultra-wealthy individuals. Until the relevant taxes have been paid. Once frozen, these wealthy people must immediately use cash to pay the fines to reactivate their accounts, otherwise the entire account remains frozen. So, everyone, take a look. Isn't it scary? The Financial Times even explained for the CCP that this series of tax reforms will bring China's tax system closer to the United States approach. Because under the United States tax system, taxpayers usually need to pay taxes on their global income. Pay taxes, you know? Like, if an American goes to China or to India and makes money, the United States is going to tax that. But that's just a simple way of putting it. If you look at the details, it's not like that. The United States does require Americans to pay taxes on their global income. But if you've already paid taxes abroad, those tax payments can be credited. It's a tax for tax credit. What does that mean? It means, for example, an American doing business in China makes, say, $10 million. Then, according to the United States tax system, say 21%, they'd owe the government $2.1 million. But if they've already paid $2 million in China, they only have to pay $100,000. You see what I mean by this? But if they've already paid $3 million in China, which is over $2.1 million, then they don't have to pay a single cent to the United States government. So the United States doesn't do double taxation. That's the first point. Second, if they were normally improving China's tax system, first, they wouldn't target a specific group of wealthy people. This is very strange no matter how you look at it. Second, and this is key, it wouldn't be retroactive. Retroactivity, almost no laws work that way. But this thing is retroactive, and not just for 2 or 3 years, but for 25 years. Doing this is like burning bridges. You're not just offending the rich, you might actually empty out, say, half of their assets. So it's like you owe 25 years of taxes and have to pay it all in 1 year. How do you pay that? So only when the CCP is desperate would they recklessly do something like this, leaving no way out, no room for retreat. So the only logical conclusion is that the CCP is truly broke and is now in a money-grabbing mode. Of course, grabbing money works. Actually, while they haven't issued new entry-exit regulations yet, they've already imposed stricter taxation on the wealthy, just not openly. In 2025, the CCP's personal income tax revenue grew by 12%, far exceeding the overall tax revenue growth of only 0.8%, according to official data. Now, what's the scariest part here? Who exactly does the CCP government consider a tax resident? Okay, so who does it actually affect? If you're wealthy, as the Financial Times says, no matter what foreign passport or immigration status you hold, even if you stay in China for less than 183 days a year, less than half, you could still be deemed a Chinese tax resident and must pay all taxes. Unless what? Unless you formally renounce your Chinese citizenship and no longer reside in China for most of the time. In other words, if you still have ties to China, you won't escape their so-called tax net. Well, an Asia-based lawyer for wealthy families in Hong Kong and China, David LaSalle's, said that AI now enables CCP officials to conduct forensic analysis of investment records at unprecedented speed and lower cost to catch up with you. He said that with the pressure mounting this year, at least 6 ultra-high net worth Chinese clients have pulled the trigger on plans to leave China for good. What do you think? Leave a comment. Since the new exit and entry regulations were announced, they've really shaken things up at home and abroad. People online are furious. The main question, the biggest question mark, is why are you doing this? And that's exactly the question Fang Wei's trying to answer with this show. As you know, the CCP's National Immigration Administration website posted a Q&A session with officials from the Ministry of Justice, Public Security, and Immigration. Let me read a bit of what they said. Listen and see if you think it makes any sense. The official stated, in recent years, Chinese citizens have illegally left the country to engage in cross-border gambling, telecom fraud, and other crimes, seriously endangering lives and property. Or after leaving illegally, they've transferred technology abroad, threatening national, industrial, and technological security, and so on. Let me translate that official speak for you. What they're saying is, the reason we're stopping everyone from leaving is because lately people going abroad are either scammers or tech thieves. Well, does that sound fair to you? I'd bet about half of our audience, half are Chinese Americans, and another 10% are Chinese Canadians. So when you travel back and forth to China, you're either a scammer or a tech thief. Do you think that explanation holds any water at all? Of course it doesn't make any sense. There's a Chinese saying, when things are this strange, there's a demon at work, meaning something's fishy. So all these bizarre occurrences just prove that something is definitely going on behind the scenes. All right, so that's one piece of evidence from the Financial Times. Let's look at a second piece of evidence. This one also went viral yesterday, a complaint supposedly from an insider at China's exit and entry headquarters. Now, I have to clarify, we don't know if this complaint is real or fake, we just know it's being shared everywhere. But let's read it and see if it sounds plausible. He says, I'm an insider at the Bureau of Exit and Entry. What the public sees of these new rules is only partial. Let me share what I know. He says, the new rules are a last resort. They were forced into it. Without them, assets, capital, and talent would keep fleeing even faster. With the economy already collapsing from within and the pressure to maintain stability rising, this was unavoidable. From a macro perspective, he says, the economy has been on a downward trend since the pandemic. Back then, there was still momentum from decades of reform. Even as things tightened, they still tried to save face and keep up appearances. But capital and talent follow the money. They want stability and predictability, so they'll find any way, any loophole, any connection to get out. Meanwhile, foreign capital is leaving, trade is down, and many Fortune 500 companies in China are closing or moving. Foreign exchange has collapsed. It's a long post, so I won't read it all. This is just one source, and since the CCP blocks information, right? So we can't get all the official or verified news. We just have to use our best judgment and share what we find with you all. Okay, so the next piece of third-party evidence is more practical. I'm quite sure the following's all true, because it's another reader submission from online. As we all know, I mentioned this to you a few days ago about a Japanese-Chinese person returning home, being forced to renounce their Japanese citizenship, unable to return to Japan for 10 years, and their business in Japan was ruined. Now, it seems no one has actually come forward to refute this, so it's likely true. Well, my good friend, who's also a content creator, Wei Yu, received a reader's submission. The general idea is, I've looked at it closely. He's a U.S. citizen who returned to China with a U.S. passport. As it turns out, his resignation from his workplace wasn't handled properly. Both sides disagreed. On one hand, the workplace wanted him to resign, but he said, just fire me. Because of this dispute, the workplace blocked him, preventing him from leaving. I won't go into all the details. If you're interested, you can check it out on Wei Yu's X account. I've looked at it closely, and I think it's very authentic. In other words, in the past, it was customs or public security that would stop you, and they needed a real reason. Now, provinces, cities, counties, and even workplaces can stop you. When you retire, if it doesn't, if it doesn't suit their fancy, if they're unhappy, they won't give you a so-called letter of consent. Even with a U.S. passport, you can't return to the U.S., so would you still dare to go back? Also, a Taiwanese person was flying from Egypt back to Taiwan with a layover in Shanghai. In Shanghai, while transferring to a China Eastern flight to Taipei, they wouldn't let him leave. He said, please, I'm just transferring. I haven't even entered the country. Why do I need this or that certificate? They said, you don't have this entry permit, so they wouldn't let him go. What happened in the end? We don't know, but he was basically stuck there. So all in all, it's just really, really bizarre. Also, let me tell you about something else. There's another example that's also very real. In this case, her name is Yu Tong. So what'd she say? She said, I've been entering and leaving the country for 10 years without any issues. Listen closely. This is a very ordinary thing, yet it's also quite shocking. It might be relevant to all of you. She said, this time, leaving from Shenzhen, I was screened. They took me to a tiny room and told me to put my bag and phone on a small table across from me. I couldn't hold them or speak. 2 female customs officers. Yutong's a woman, by the way. These 2 female customs officers stood at the door, staring at me intently for over 10 minutes. It was very uncomfortable. I asked what the problem was, and they just replied, it's a screening. I had no choice but to close my eyes and rest. After waiting for over 10 minutes, they told me I'd passed the screening and could leave. Luckily, I gave up my Chinese citizenship when I naturalized 40 years ago, so they had no reason to hold me. This time, I was so scared, I won't dare to go back again. I looked up this Yutong. She just posts about health, home decor, wellness, handicrafts, and things like that. Diet, and so on. That's the kind of person she is. So why were they staring at her for over 10 minutes? They wanted to see if she looked guilty, right? And second, they needed those 10 minutes to check her records. So it was completely unprovoked. Without offending the CCP in any way, she was detained on the spot. It really terrified her, and she won't dare to go back. Would you still dare? That's the question we face now. It's truly unbelievable, right? Isn't it incredible? It really is incredible. Alright, so regarding this matter, basically, in my judgment, based on 3-way evidence, the CCP's run out of money. Yeah, the CCP being broke reminds me of something. Does anyone know what happened back in 1644? That was the end of the Ming Dynasty. Li Zicheng's rebel army was closing in on the capital. Emperor Chongzhen was also broke. The treasury was empty, and what did that lead to? The soldiers weren't being paid, no military funds, severe back pay issues, and morale collapsed. Chongzhen desperately needed to raise funds back then, so he called upon the imperial relatives, the nobility, and all the officials to donate money for the troops. This is a very famous historical event known as the donation for military pay. They were assessed based on their rank and title, hoping everyone would contribute to save the nation together. In the end, nobody listened. Everyone just went through the motions. They only raised about 200,000 taels of silver, which wasn't even enough for one day's expenses. 3 months later, in April of 1644, the rebel army breached the city and Chongzhen hanged himself on Coal Hill. So, has today's regime reached that same end-of-days point as Chongzhen's? What do you all think? Is the CCP really in such dire straits? Very interesting indeed. Well, regarding the reasons behind this, whether you agree with me or have your own views, I welcome everyone to send in your submissions. Because our viewers provide us with so much valuable information, I'll share a piece of that with you shortly. Every one of you could be a citizen journalist, as someone with inside knowledge. Now, let's move on to some big news from the U.S. I've been talking about this for 2 days now. Mandarin has appeared in Michigan. So what's the strategy behind it? Okay, the results for the Michigan Democratic Senate primary are in. Syed has emerged victorious, narrowly defeating his opponent, Democratic establishment candidate Stevens, by less than 1 percentage point. So this is essentially the Socialist Party defeating the Democratic Party. More accurately, it's the Socialists defeating the Democrats from within. Isn't that just pathetic for the Democrats? And now, he has a chance on October 3rd to actually win that Senate seat. If he can beat the Republican, Mike Rogers, who is endorsed by President Trump, then we're looking at a showdown between Mike Rogers and Syed on November 3rd. As I mentioned yesterday, this is a direct confrontation between MAGA, Make America Great Again, and the DSA. It's traditional America versus a socialist America. Now, this opportunity arose because the incumbent Democratic Senator, Gary Peters, who had the advantage of incumbency, decided to step down. His sudden retirement gave the DSA their first real opening to make a breakthrough at the state level. I told you yesterday that he was just fed up, so he quit to go do what he actually wants to do. Why do I say that? Because that's what he said himself. I even explained for him, if he really doesn't like being a senator, then so be it, right? It's his choice, and that's the best thing about a free America. Well, this morning I saw a letter from a reader, a message left by one of our viewers. Take a look. It basically says this: regarding what you said yesterday about Peter's retirement, here's the situation. He says there are nearly 300,000 Muslims in Michigan. The issue isn't the different religions, it's the, how should I put it? The militancy they show, this ambition to swallow up other religions and cultures, which is worrying. He says the current Democratic Senator, Gary Peters, is dropping out because, listen closely now, because he feels that he and his family are being threatened. My good friend is his neighbor. Last summer, every time he came home, meaning home from D.C., Muslims would gather at his door at 5 in the morning, using electric bullhorns to shout at him to step down. Because Gary Peters supports Jewish people, many Democrats support Jewish people, including the Democratic leader, right? Senate Leader Chuck Schumer is Jewish himself. Okay, so this viewer says they ignored the neighbors' protests and demonstrated loudly every day, determined to destroy him. With constant threats, they've finally gotten their way. That's what made Peters drop out. That's the real reason he's not running. The person who publicly said the U.S. deserved 9/11 is now taken over, referring to Syed. Okay. So this is from our viewer, whose name is Good Time to Bad Time. He says his friend lives right next door to Senator Peters. Now, if what he describes is true, do you think it's true? I think it's true. Why would my viewers send me fake news, right? It wouldn't help them, right? So it must be true. I believe it's true. If that's the case, it makes sense. Peters was forced out.